Hi, how did lesson 3 go? Are you now starting to become much more aware of what triggers you emotionally as you go through your day? You know, what people in your life are triggering you? Maybe someone you work with, maybe a boss, maybe a partner at home. You know, the important thing here is this at this stage, we are just starting to notice and be much more aware of what our triggers are. You know, automatically we start thinking that we have to remove these triggers from our lives, but that isn't necessarily the answer. You know, in some instances that's not even possible. So awareness is the first point of being able to start breaking out of this cycle. And lesson 4 is that's exactly what we're going to start doing. So the cycle of overeating has 4 stages to it. Okay, you have the trigger phase, and that's what we've been looking at over the in lessons 2 and in lessons 3. The more aware you can become of what triggers you emotionally, what triggers this emotional shift for you. You know, we talked about the inner child. You know, sometimes we have these emotional responses to things that are childlike, not childish, childlike. So we respond to things in ways we would have done when we were much younger. So the more we can start to become aware of what triggers us on a day-to-day basis, the more information we have and the more awareness that we have, that's when we can start to actually implement positive change that's actually related to those emotional triggers. So we get triggered. So when we start to look at the overeating or the cycle of overeating, something happens that triggers us. Okay, that then leads us to eating something, and quite often it's high fat, high sugar. They're called comfort foods for a reason. So this is kind of like the cover up phase of the cycle. So we get triggered. Alert behavior is we eat something that kind of masks the emotion that we're feeling. So this is a repeated strategy that we've done maybe from childhood, or maybe it was a strategy we learnt later in life. But this connection between emotional trigger and cover up, eating something to mask those feelings, has been a very well-worn habit and go-to option as a way of masking our emotions. So we then have this, eating has become the cover up for the emotion. Okay, and that then puts us into what is kind of like a false bliss. You know, we eat something, it temporarily makes us feel better, so it kind of feels like a really good solution because it takes us away, or it masks the anger or the sadness or the frustration or the fear that we were experiencing. So we eat something, it covers that. We then go into this false bliss state of feeling temporarily better. But of course, as most of you know, that's often quite short-lived. And then what happens is we go into the hangover phase. So this is the part where we start to feel guilty, full of remorse, and we start to be much more conscious of the consequences of that pattern that we've gone through. So we go from trigger to the food being the cover up. We have this temporary moment of feeling blissful, but then very quickly we move into the hangover phase. And of course, that part of the process is often taps into our guilt and our shame, which then kind of triggers another emotional response. And so you can see how we start to get caught in these cycles of emotional eating. So I've stressed over the last few lessons how important knowing what your triggers are, and you know, you can see within these 4 stages of the process that knowing your triggers, knowing what fires off, what makes you have an emotional response to things, is hugely, hugely important. So how do we break the cycle, this emotional eating cycle? And then probably until now, the way in which you've done this is by going on another diet. Okay, although we kind of have awareness that we're caught in this emotional eating cycle, quite often we see the only solution will be to actually lose weight, because although we kind of have awareness that our overeating isn't just about our weight, it is about all these other things that are going on in our lives and our responses to them. Diet seems the way in which the thing that we focus on. We kind of can get bought into this illusion that if we lose weight, then all of this other stuff won't happen. And for some people, that may actually be the case. But for most of us, and certainly from my own experience, I know when I lost weight, so I was 19 stone at my heaviest. and over a 5-year period I lost 8 stone. So I went from living in a world of being very overweight and all of those insecurities to then being a sort of size 10 to 12. And in lots of ways, being smaller was great, from a clothes perspective, and just kind of feeling more comfortable in my size when I was around people. But actually, what happened for me was I I actually was more insecure than I ever was when I was overweight, because all of a sudden I was thrust into a very different world. So I was in a world where all of a sudden men found me attractive, and I had to deal with that. Up until that point, I'd not really had many boyfriends, and so I'd not been exposed to that world. And then all of a sudden I was being asked out from people who had been friends, who hadn't been interested in me when I was overweight. So for me, losing weight was a real challenge emotionally for me, because it's not a world that I had ever lived in. And I found that my insecurities around trust got really, really stimulated. And it was only when I'd gone through this cycle of losing weight and realizing that it wasn't the answer that I'd put all my hopes on, that I then started my own personal counselling journey to actually start to look at these more underlying triggers that were going on for me that had led me to overeating. And then all of a sudden, when I had moved away from this emotional eating cycle, I kind of felt like I was in no man's land. And that was when it was really highlighted to me that I needed to start to understand some of this more deep-rooted stuff. So breaking the cycle, it does start by awareness. It starts by knowing your triggers, and you're already starting to work on that. So building your awareness is a fundamental stage of this long-term change process, and getting to the root of what's really going on for you. And that can be a challenging in itself. If you're in a marriage or a relationship when you're not feeling 100% fulfilled, and that at times triggers you to overeating, when you actually start to be honest with yourself and be honest with that situation, and you start looking at the deeper root cause of your overeating, that can throw up some challenges that you don't feel ready, or you're not equipped to actually start dealing with. So the whole process of starting to delve a bit deeper can be quite a scary one. And I often hear clients relate to they just put their emotions or the things in a box, and they close the lid, like everything gets tucked away in this little neat place that they don't have to look at or handle. But of course it doesn't work like that. You can keep the lid on that box for so long, but every now and again that lid will kind of peep off, and some of that stuff will come out, and you will probably recognize these cycles in your own life. So getting to the root of what's going on for you and your emotional eating is really important, but also it can be quite scary. So I completely understand that, which is why we need to take this one step at a time. So this courses are really about starting to help you to firstly understand, to acknowledge, and to be honest with yourself, but then to start to look at what are your options in terms of starting to work on some of this stuff. For some of you, the answer, once you start to establish the deep roots, the causes of your overeating, you'll want to tackle it head on, and you'll want to deal with these issues directly, and that's absolutely fine. And in some ways it is the easiest way. Once you become aware of a problem, it makes sense to deal with it directly. But again, sometimes to do that you need to learn new skills, and certainly if it's involving other people, it's not always as black and white as that. So one option is to tackle the stuff you're learning about yourself head on, but for most of us it's going to be a little less direct, and it's going to be about building a toolkit of healthy habits that we can introduce into our lives on a day-to-day basis that are going to actually help us to stay in a more adult, buoyant place with our emotions. Because there's two ways of looking at this. You know, this is all about your emotional triggers. So the ideal situation is that we actually start to look at what is triggering you and reduce the amount of times that you get triggered on a day-to-day basis. And we need awareness for that to be able to happen. But for many of us, what we also need is we need to have good, healthy coping strategies in place for when we are triggered. So when we get triggered emotionally, you know, we need to have strategies in place that we can work on rather than go into the biscuit barrel, rather than going headfirst into a tub of ice cream. So it's about looking at things from a prevention and a cure perspective. And today, or your lesson for today, one of the areas I want us to start looking at is something called mindful eating. So lesson 4 for you to get involved in this week and ongoing for the rest of the course. So not only are you now starting to identify your triggers, your emotional triggers on a daily basis and write them down, what I also want you to practice is mindful eating. Now, I'll hold my hands up. You know, I'll be the first to admit that I'm a super fast eater. You know, if I'm not conscious about my eating, if I don't sit down and eat consciously, I can wolf my dinner down and not even realise that I've had it. I've tracked that back. I know where that comes from. You know, my mum was an obsessive cleaner and tidy awayer. And if we didn't eat our dinner quickly, she would literally be like taking the plates from under us. So I kind of know that that's kind of where that started. And also this praise and recognition that I would get, you know, if I ate really, really quickly, I know I got praised for that. So my whole relationship around eating fast has been with me for a long time, you know, but it's not helpful. So when we start to actually look at our relationship with food, food is there to be enjoyed, it's there to be savoured. And if we're eating without really being present, you know, we're wolfing it down, we're sat in front of the telly, we're not even making that connection with the food. So this week you're going to have an opportunity to start to explore mindful eating. And I've written more about mindful eating under the lesson itself. So click on the link and go and have a read. But mindful eating it's a bit like mindfulness generally. It's about starting to be much more present and much more aware of everything that you are putting in your mouth. You know, they say on average someone eats 10 times a day. So that gives you an idea of just how automatic we reach for food and eat without even making that recognition that we've done it. And so I know most days I'll run through what I've eaten on and throughout the day, and I'll think, oh, that's not too bad, and then I'll remember something else, and I'll remember something else, which is why food diaries are quite a useful tool to use. The trouble there is it's about our honesty and how honest we are when we fill them out. So these are all great tools, but they're only useful tools if you are honest whilst you're doing them. So mindful eating is all about being much more present whilst you're eating. So it's kind of very much focused on making your preparation of food and your eating of food the thing that you are doing. So it becomes a much more present in the here and now act. And there's a sequence of questions that you can go through when you are reaching for food. So you're starting to teach yourself to get into the habit of asking yourself some questions around why you're reaching for that food. So lesson 4, for this lesson and for the rest of the course, I want you to practice mindful eating. So what does that involve? So it's things like sitting down and eating as often as you possibly can, removing any distracting stimulus, so no phones, no talking to somebody on the phone, turn the telly off, so no obvious distractions, so no multitasking. You know I'm, especially at lunchtime, I am the queen of I'll make a sandwich or something and I'll be walking around the kitchen cleaning down or getting dinner ready or something like that whilst I'm eating. So no multitasking as you're eating, and also becoming more mindful, you know, how much you're chewing, you know, noticing smells and sights, and just making the whole process of eating much more present. So being more aware of what's actually going on for you. And then there's some questions that I want you to ask yourself before eating, and they're all listed in the lesson. And then also some questions I want you to ask yourself after you've eaten. So these, just getting into the habit of asking these questions, so you're becoming much more connected to the whole process of eating. So this can be done at your main meal times, but if you can really start to apply it to every single time you go to eat something. So it's bringing your unconscious eating, you know, the eating that you do out of awareness, so automatically it's like we're on autopilot, much more into the present and into your conscious state. So you are really, really focused on what it is you're doing. So I love this exercise. It's a really nice, simple thing to do, but it's something that you need to practice in order to become more fluent at doing it. So again, like all the lessons, be curious about what comes up for you. Do you engage in it? How do you find the exercise? Are you resisting it? What might that be about for you? So again, it's really important, the reflection work that you do at the end of the lesson, it can be as powerful as actually doing the lesson. So enjoy your mindfulness, and don't forget to keep writing those triggers down as well. Catch you all for the next lesson.